Hello, my name is Zach, and you're welcome to the Sage Chronicles, where real African family stories meet wisdom. I share these stories not for revenge, but to teach boundaries, self-respect, and how to seek justice through legal and peaceful means. Stay with me to the end for today's lesson. Let's begin.
Imagine coming home from a long day of work, tired, hungry, thinking only of your bed, and discovering that your key no longer opens your own front door. Not a stock lock, not a mechanical fault. Someone had gone into that door with a screwdriver, removed the old lock, and fitted a new one in the middle of the day while you were away earning the money that put a roof over everyone's head in that compound. That is exactly what happened to a woman named Lara on a Tuesday evening in Lagos. And by the time she found out who had done it and why, she would learn something about her marriage that 8 years of living with the man had never shown her. If you enjoy stories like this, ones that sit with you long after they end, stay with me to the finish. And if you like emotional, true-to-life Nigerian stories, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Because to understand why a 23-year-old girl would dare to change the locks on a woman who had sponsored her through university, you have to understand the kind of person Lara was. Lara Adeyemi was not a woman who did things by half measure. She ran a fabric and event decoration business out of a shop in Yaba, a business that started with 2 sewing machines and a small generator and grew, over 12 years, into a proper storefront with 4 staff. She was the last child of her father, a retired civil servant who died when she was 26, and the one thing he left her in a will that surprised even her older brothers was the house in Ogudu. Not the business, not the car, not the small farmland in Ogun State. The house, written in his own shaking hand, to go to the child who had stayed closest to him in his final years. Her brothers grumbled for a season and let it go, because that was the kind of family they were, more interested in peace than property. That house would matter later, more than anyone could have guessed on the day the will was read. Lara married Tunde Bankole when she was 29. He was a quantity surveyor, smooth-talking and well-dressed, the kind of man that made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. Their first years together were, by any honest account, good years. They had no children, a fact that caused Lara private grief and occasional unkind comments from aunties at family functions, but Tunde never once made her feel less than whole because of it. He would rub her back on the nights she cried quietly, thinking he was asleep, and tell her that a house did not need a child's noise to be a home. She loved him fiercely for that tenderness, and for a long time, it was enough. It was in the 6th year of their marriage that Chiamaka Okonkwo came into their lives. She was the daughter of a woman named Mama Chiamaka, who used to sell tomatoes and pepper at the market close to Lara's childhood home, back when Lara was still a small girl running errands for her own mother. Mama Chiamaka's husband had died young, leaving her to raise 3 children alone on the little money from a market stall, and Chiamaka, the last of the 3, had always been the sharp one, the one who came first in her class even when she had no lantern to read at night and had to squint under the security light at the compound gate. When Chiamaka finished secondary school with results good enough to make her teachers proud, her mother came to Lara, not to beg exactly, because Mama Chiamaka was not a begging woman, but to ask with the dignity of someone who has never asked anyone for anything, whether Lara might help her last child go further. Lara remembered being a girl running past that tomato store, remembered the woman's kindness in giving her own mother credit during lean months, and something in her simply said yes. She brought Chiamaka to Lagos to live with them, to help small around the house, and enrolled her at a polytechnic first, then later, when the results proved strong enough, at a proper university to study accounting. For nearly 3 years, that arrangement worked the way such arrangements are supposed to. Chiamaka called Lara auntie with real affection, not the flat, obligatory kind some house helps perform for their madams, but something that came from an actual place of gratitude. She helped in the kitchen on weekends, was polite to visitors, read her books at the small balcony table in the evenings, And Lara, watching her, sometimes felt a quiet pride, the kind a woman feels watching a much younger sister grow into herself. Tunde treated her well too, the way an uncle treats a niece, asking about her coursework, slipping her extra money for textbooks without being asked. Nobody in that house saw anything except a family stretching itself wider to include a girl who deserved a chance. It was in Chiamaka's third year that small things began to shift, so small that Lara, busy with a new set of contracts for a big Lagos wedding season, never thought to examine them. Tunde began finding more reasons to be home in the afternoons on the days Lara traveled for supply runs to Aba or Kano. He started praising Chiamaka's cooking with a warmth that in hindsight lingered a bit too long. Chiamaka, for her part, began to dress a little differently around the house on those afternoons. Nothing a suspicious woman would catch immediately, just a slight care in how her wapa sat, a slight brightness when Tunde walked into a room. Lara noticed none of it. She was not a foolish woman. She simply believed, the way people believe about the ground they've walked on for years, that it would hold. The affair, when it began in earnest in the final months of Chiamaka's studies, was carried out with a carelessness that suggested Tunde had grown too comfortable in his own house to imagine discovery. He did not take Chiamaka to hotels where a driver might recognize him. He simply waited for the afternoons Lara was out, and the two of them moved from stolen glances into something else entirely in the very bedroom Lara shared with her husband, on the very sheet she had chosen and washed herself, believing the whole time she was building a home rather than watching one hollow out from the inside. For Chiamaka, it did not feel, in those first months, like being stolen. It felt like being seen. No man had ever asked her opinion on anything the way Tunde did, sitting across from her at the dining table on those quiet afternoons, asking what she thought about her coursework, about her plans, about the kind of life she wanted once she graduated, as though her answers actually mattered to someone. Her own father had died before she was old enough to remember his voice properly. She told herself in the moment she allowed herself to think about it at all, that this was different from what it looked like, that whatever it was between her and Lara's husband existed in some separate room of the world that did not touch the woman who had paid her school fees. It was easier to believe that than to look directly at what she was doing. Discovery came, as it often does, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through something small and mechanical. An ordinary Sunday afternoon in the raining season. Chiamaka's phone, an old model with a cracked screen, had begun acting up, freezing and restarting on its own, and worried about losing her final year project files. She asked Lara for help backing it up before taking it to repair. It was such an innocent request that Lara agreed without a second thought, sitting with her at the dining table while the backup software copied everything across, messages included, because Chiamaka had not, thinking in her academic panic, to consider what conversations lived in that phone. The messages appeared in a folder Lara opened only to confirm the backup had worked. And there, in a thread saved simply as T, she found 2 years of a language she recognized instantly as the language of an affair. Tender at first, reckless in the middle, and in recent weeks disturbingly domestic, the messages of 2 people who had stopped hiding and started planning. Lara sat very still at that table, the smell of Sunday's jollof rice still hanging in the kitchen air, and read message after message with a calm that frightened her more than tears would have. She did not scream, she did not call out for Chiamaka, unaware in the next room. She simply closed the laptop, gathered herself, and began to think. She thought about the 8 years of her marriage, replaying afternoons she had considered unremarkable, how Tunde began locking his phone with a passcode a year and a half earlier, how he answered calls on the balcony with the door pulled almost shut, and how Chiamaka's final year somehow needed more evening study sessions at exactly the hours Tunde came home. None of it seemed significant alone. Together, laid end to end against the dates in that message thread, it formed a picture so complete that Lara felt almost embarrassed at how long she had failed to see it. She did not confront either of them that evening. This surprised even her later. because she had always imagined herself as a woman who would explode immediately upon discovering betrayal, the type to throw plates and scream the compound awake. Instead, something colder and more deliberate took hold of her. She served the jollof rice as planned. She sat through dinner watching Tunde tell a mildly funny story, watching Chiamaka laugh at the right moments in the practiced way of someone performing normalcy. And Lara laughed too, because she needed time to understand the full shape of what she was dealing with before she moved. Over the following 2 weeks, without confronting anyone, Lara quietly gathered more. She noted the exact days Tunde claimed to be working late. She checked the account from which certain unexplained withdrawals had been made, small amounts she had once assumed were work expenses. She told only her sister, not for advice, but simply because she needed one other human being to know the truth was real. Yewande wanted her to confront them immediately, to bring the whole family in. But Lara asked her to wait because a plan was forming in her, quiet and exact. The kind of plan that comes from a woman who knows the person who moves first from anger usually loses the advantage. It was during this watching period that Lara learned the twist that would complicate everything further. In the 3rd week after her discovery, she noticed Chiamaka had stopped eating breakfast some mornings, had begun disappearing to the bathroom with a frequency Lara, as a woman, recognized instantly for what it likely was. She said nothing and confirmed her suspicion 2 days later when she found, while doing what she told herself was ordinary laundry sorting, but was in truth a kind of investigation, a used pregnancy test hidden at the bottom of the bathroom bin. Lara sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long while, and for the first time since finding the messages, she cried. Not loudly, but the quiet, exhausted tears of a woman absorbing one blow too many. She was 40 years old, had wanted a child for the entirety of her marriage, and had been told, gently, by 2 different doctors, that her chances were slim. And now the girl she had raised almost as her own, the girl she had paid tuition for and sat up with during malaria fevers, was carrying a child for Lara's own husband. There was a cruelty in the timing so precise it felt almost designed, though Lara understood, even through her tears, that this was simply how life sometimes arranged itself. Carelessness compounding carelessness until it landed somewhere unbearable. If you are finding yourself invested in Lara's story, this is usually the point where I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is where everything turns, and I don't want you to miss it. What Lara did not yet know was the exact story Tunde had been feeding Chiamaka to keep her calm and compliant. It would come out only later in the confrontation, but it explained something that would otherwise seem impossible. How a girl who had once called Lara auntie with real warmth could convince herself that changing the locks was not betrayal, but preparation for a future already promised to her. Tunde had told Chiamaka over many months, in the careful, drip-fed way of a man managing 2 lives, that his marriage was already dead in every way that mattered, that Lara had grown cold and distant, that she had begun speaking of relocating to Canada, where her sister Yewande lived. He said that when Lara finally left for that new life, the marriage would dissolve on its own. No scandal, no one's reputation destroyed, simply 2 people drifting apart. He told Chiamaka that when that day came, she would become the woman of the house, and that he intended to marry her properly and give her child his name. He was, in his telling, not a man having an affair with his ward, but a man patiently waiting for an already broken marriage to end so he could build a new, honest one. It was, of course, an almost complete fabrication. Lara had mentioned Canada perhaps twice in her entire marriage, once about a business trip, once in an offhand joke about wanting cooler weather. Tunde had taken these fragments and built an entire narrative from them, the way skilled manipulators often do, not inventing lies from nothing, but twisting small truths into convenient shapes. And Chiamaka, 23, pregnant, frightened, far from her mother,
and deeply, foolishly in love with a man 20 years her senior, believed him. Not because she was stupid, but because belief was easier than confronting the fact that she had helped destroy the family that raised her for a man who might simply be using her. It was against this backdrop of manufactured belief that Tunde made his decision to have the locks changed. He did not consult Chiamaka on strategy so much as instruct her, framing it as a practical step for when Madame finally travels, giving her money one Thursday afternoon and the number of a locksmith he trusted, telling her it would look less suspicious for the house girl to make the call than for him to be seen doing it. Chiamaka, wanting to please him and prove herself capable of the new life he'd promised, agreed without much hesitation. She told herself it was harmless, a practical matter. She did not let herself think too hard about whose name was on the house, or what it would mean for Lara to come home and find herself locked out of a life she had built. The Tuesday it happened began as an unremarkable day. Lara spent the morning overseeing asoebi orders for a large wedding, ate a late lunch at her desk, exchanged a few ordinary texts with Tunde about dinner plans and generator fuel. She left the shop a little after 6, tired from 10 hours on her feet, and drove home through the usual Lagos traffic thinking only of a hot bath and an early night. Her key would not turn in the lock. She tried it twice, assuming at first that she had somehow picked the wrong key, checking her key ring under the dim glow of her phone's torchlight, confirming it was indeed the correct key, the one she had used every single day for the past 4 years since moving into this particular configuration of the house. She knocked. There was a long pause before she heard movement inside, hesitant footsteps, a whispered exchange too quiet to make out, and then Chiamaka's voice, unsteady, coming from just behind the door rather than opening it. Chiamaka said, "Auntie?" And there was something in the way she said it, a mixture of guilt and rehearsed courage that told Lara immediately this was not an accident, not a faulty lock, not some misunderstanding that a locksmith could resolve in 20 minutes. Lara stood on her own veranda, in front of her own door, in a house that had legally belonged to her since her father's death, and absorbed the surreal humiliation of being told by a 23-year-old girl that she needed her own husband's permission to enter. She did not shout. She did not bang on the door the way every instinct in her body screamed to do. She stood very still, feeling something settle inside her, cold and clear, the last fragile piece of denial she had been carrying finally breaking apart, and she said, in a voice so level it surprised even her, "Chiamaka, open this door." There was a long silence, and then the sound of a bolt sliding, slow and reluctant, and the door opened to reveal Chiamaka standing in the doorway in one of Lara's own old house wrappers, her belly just beginning to show beneath the fabric, her eyes red-rimmed from what looked like recent crying, her whole posture caught between defiance and terror. Behind her, the sitting room looked subtly rearranged, a few of Lara's photographs turned face down on the side table, a jacket that was not Lara's draped over the armchair, small signs of a girl who had begun quietly to make herself at home in a house that was not hers. "Uncle said you people are separating. He said you are traveling to Canada. He said I should protect the house until he settles everything because of the baby."
Lara looked at her for a long moment, at this girl she had once carried textbooks for at university registration. This girl whose secondary school WAEC results she had celebrated with a small party. This girl who was now standing in her doorway, pregnant with her husband's child, repeating a story so absurd, so transparently self-serving to the man who had constructed it, that Lara felt something close to pity underneath the anger. The specific pity you feel watching someone you love be made a fool of by someone else, even when that someone you love has also deeply wronged you. "Is that what he told you?" Lara said. It was not really a question. She walked past Chiamaka into her own sitting room, set her bag down on the dining table with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, and asked Chiamaka to sit down because there was a conversation they needed to have, and it was not going to happen with either of them standing in doorways like strangers. Chiamaka hesitated, glancing toward the bedroom as though hoping Tunde would materialize to rescue her from this moment, but he was not home yet, and so, slowly, she sat. What followed was not the screaming match either of them might have expected from such a scene in a film. Lara asked questions, and Chiamaka, worn down by months of secrecy and fear, and now confronted directly, began to answer them, haltingly at first and then in a flood. The whole story spilling out of her, the 2 years of the relationship, the promises Tunde had made, the story about Canada, the plan for the locks, the fear she had been carrying alone about the pregnancy, about what her own mother would say, about what kind of person she had become. She cried through most of it, and Lara, listening, felt her anger settle into something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that the girl in front of her was not the true architect of this betrayal, merely its youngest and most vulnerable participant, manipulated by a man who had spent 2 decades longer than her, learning how to make lies sound like love. It was Lara who suggested, in a moment that surprised even her, that they call Chiamaka's mother. Not out of cruelty, but because some part of her understood that Chiamaka needed to hear the truth from a voice that had known her longer than Tunde's lies had, one that could cut through 2 years of manipulation in a way Lara's own words, colored by her own hurt, might not. Chiamaka resisted, pleading that her mother would curse her, that she could not bear the shame, but Lara held firm and dialed the number herself, putting the phone on speaker between them. Mama Chiamaka answered on the 3rd ring, warm and unsuspecting, greeting Lara with the respect she had always shown her, asking after her health, asking as she always did when Lara might finally give her a grandchild to spoil, unaware of the irony inside that ordinary question. Lara did not soften the truth. She told her, plainly, that Chiamaka was pregnant for her husband, that the girl believed a lie about an impending divorce, and that the locks on her own house had been changed that very afternoon by Chiamaka's own hand at Tunde's instruction. There was a silence so complete that Lara wondered if the call had dropped. Then Mama Chiamaka's voice came back, and it was not the warm Market One woman who had greeted her moments before. It was low, and it shook, not with sadness, but with a fury that seemed to have been waiting for this call, or one like it, for a long time. Chiamaka, her mother said, and even through the teeny phone speaker, the weight in that single word made the girl flinch as though struck. Is it true? Chiamaka could not answer at first. She was crying too hard, her shoulders shaking, one hand pressed against her mouth as though she could physically hold back the shame trying to escape her. I asked you a question, her mother said, and then without waiting for the answer she already knew, she began to speak. What followed was not simply a scolding, though it contained plenty of that, but something closer to a lament, a mother's grief and hard-won wisdom that Lara herself would remember for years. Mama Chiamaka spoke of her own late husband, and of how she herself, as a young bride, had once believed the sweet words of a man who told her his first wife meant nothing to him anymore, only to learn too late what it cost a woman to build her life on another woman's ruins. She said no man who truly loved a woman would ask her to steal another woman's home, that a man who could lie to his wife of 8 years without shame would lie to Chiamaka just as easily, that a house built on another person's pain never stood for long. She told her daughter bluntly that changing another woman's locks was not love, it was theft, dressed up in a wrapper of romance by a man too cowardly to leave his marriage honestly. You have disgraced me, Mama Chiamaka said finally, her voice breaking at last, the fury giving way to something more exhausted and more painful, plain grief. I did not send you to Lagos to become another woman's enemy in her own house. I sent you to become somebody. Come back to yourself, Chiamaka, before that man finishes what he has started with you. The call ended not long after, Mama Chiamaka too overcome to continue, and the silence that followed in Lara's sitting room was heavy and complete. Chiamaka sat with her face in her hands, curled forward as though trying to make herself smaller, and Lara, watching her, felt the last of her own anger drain away, replaced by something quieter and sadder. The
the sorrow of watching someone young pay the earliest installment of a debt a grown man should have owed. It was into this scene that Tunde walked, perhaps 40 minutes later, whistling as he came up the veranda steps, unaware that his careful architecture of lies had already collapsed in his absence. He stopped whistling the moment he saw Lara's car in the driveway, and by the time he found his wife sitting calmly at the dining table, across from a weeping Chiamaka, his face moved through confusion, calculation, and finally a resigned fear. The look of a man realizing the walls around his two lives had just come down at once. He tried briefly to talk his way through it, reaching first to denial, then minimization, then when Lara simply looked at him without speaking, a kind of wounded indignation, as though he was the aggrieved party in a marriage he had spent 2 years dismantling. Lara let him talk for perhaps 2 minutes, watching him with an expression that unsettled him more than shouting would have, and then said quietly, "Tunde, sit down. You will not raise your voice in this house tonight. You have done enough talking for a lifetime." What followed was not a fight in the way either of them might have braced for. Lara did not scream, did not throw anything, did not call the police, though the thought had crossed her mind. Instead, she spoke with the same clarity she brought to negotiating supply contracts, laying out exactly what she knew: the messages, the withdrawals, the pregnancy, the lie about Canada, the locksmith, watching Tunde's face as each piece removed one more avenue of denial, until he sat slumped in the chair that had been his for 8 years, saying almost nothing because there was nothing left to say. She told him finally that he would pack his things that night into whatever bags he could fill within the hour, because she would not spend one more evening under the same roof as a man who had let another woman change the locks on her father's house. She told Chiamaka more gently that she was not putting her out into the street, that whatever else was true, Chiamaka was still pregnant, and still in some complicated way someone she had once loved like family, but that she could not stay in this house either. They would go together to Tunde's old self-contained apartment in Ojota, which Lara knew from managing their finances would be vacant within the month. Until then, they could manage between themselves, but not under her roof. There was a brief ugly moment where Tunde tried to remind her that this was his house too, that he had contributed to its upkeep, that he had every right to remain, and it was here that Lara delivered the fact that ended the argument entirely. The house, she said, in a voice gone very quiet and very final, had never been his. It had been her father's, left to her, her name alone in the documents in the study he had never once bothered to look through in 8 years of marriage. He had lived in her father's house, on her father's inheritance, and used the security of that roof to carry on an affair with a girl she had raised. Now, that roof would shelter neither him nor his mistake.
Tunde left that night with 2 suitcases hurriedly packed and a face that had lost all its earlier smoothness. Chiamaka left with him, not because Lara forced her hand cruelly, but because there was nowhere else for the girl to go that night, and because some tangled remnant of loyalty still bound him to the man who had gotten her into this position. Lara stood at her own door and watched them go, disappearing down the dark street together, and she did not cry until the sound of Tunde's car had faded. And even then, she cried standing up, alone in her own sitting room, in the house that was, once again, entirely hers. In the weeks that followed, Lara did not pretend the healing was instant, because it was not. There were mornings she woke from habit, reaching for a side of the bed that was now permanently empty. She spoke to a counselor a colleague recommended, working through not just the betrayal, but the secondary grief of losing the version of herself who had trusted so completely. She leaned on Yewande, who flew in from Canada for 2 weeks simply to sit with her in the evenings and remind her, in the blunt, loving way only a sister can, that trusting a man for 8 years was not a character flaw, and that building a life from nothing but her own 2 hands was not something one lying husband could erase. She continued paying Chiamaka's final semester fees. This surprised nearly everyone, her sister included. But Lara explained it simply to Yewande one evening. She had made a promise to a market woman years ago, a promise that had nothing to do with Tunde and everything to do with the girl who had once come first in her class with no lantern to study by. Cutting Chiamaka's education now would not punish Tunde, it would only punish a young woman manipulated by a man 20 years her senior and an unborn child who had no part in any of it. Lara was not interested in being wicked simply because she had been wronged. She paid the fees directly to the school, not to Chiamaka's account, and made clear in one brief business-like call that this support did not mean the door to her house was open again. Chiamaka could finish her degree, she could not come back. Chiamaka herself, once the fog of Tunde's promises had cleared enough to see her situation plainly, a rented, self-contained room, a man whose charm had curdled into irritation now that the affair carried real consequences, a baby coming, and a mother's curse still ringing in her ears, wrote Lara a long letter by hand. She did not ask to be forgiven. She wrote that she understood now what her mother had meant, that she had mistaken a man's convenience for love, and that no one had ever made her feel as safe and valued as Lara had before she let a promise of a bigger future blind her to the person already giving her one. She thanked her for the fees, for the years before, for everything, and signed it with her full name, the way a child signs something she means to be taken seriously. Lara read it once in her father's old study and did not answer immediately because some wounds need time before they can hold even the weight of a reply. Months later, after Chiamaka had graduated and the baby, a girl, had been born, she finally sent one message back. Brief, not warm exactly, but not cold either. She told her a woman's worth was never something a man got to decide for her, and that Chiamaka was still young enough to build something entirely on her own. As for Tunde, his story ended the way such stories often do. Not in some dramatic reckoning, but in a slow, unglamorous unraveling. The affair, once it had cost him his marriage and his comfortable home, lost whatever illusion of romance it had sustained it. And within a year, he and Chiamaka had separated as well. He continued, at Lara's quiet insistence relayed once through a mutual acquaintance, to pay something towards the child's upkeep, a small mercy Lara extracted not for his sake but for the baby's. He moved twice in the 2 years after the divorce, each time to a smaller place than the last. A cousin of Lara's ran into him once at a filling station in Ojota, alone, filling a small Kekes tank instead of the SUV he used to drive, and reported back only that he had looked, more than anything, tired. Lara herself rebuilt slowly and then with surprising speed. Her business, freed of whatever quiet distractions 8 years of a fraying marriage had cost it, without her fully realizing, grew faster in the 2 years after the divorce than it had in the previous 5 combined. She expanded the shop, took on a business partner, began mentoring young women from her old neighborhood the way she once had Chiamaka, though more carefully now, with clearer boundaries and a wiser eye. She did not remarry quickly, and when people asked her about it, at family gatherings with the particular nosy affection Nigerian aunties reserve for such questions, she would simply smile and say that she was not in a hurry, that she had learned the hard way that a house is worth nothing if you cannot trust who holds the second key, and that she intended from now on to be very careful about who she handed one to. Lara still has the letter, folded in that same drawer in her father's study. She has not thrown it away, and she has not framed it either. Some evenings, going through old files, her hand brushes it, and she leaves it exactly where it is. That is perhaps the truest ending there is. Not forgiveness, not enmity, just a woman who built her own roof twice in one lifetime and learned, the second time, precisely whose name to put it on. If this story moved you, if you found yourself thinking about Lara or Chiamaka or that mother's voice coming down the phone line like judgment and grief all at once, I'd love to have you back for the next one. These are the stories that stay with us, the quiet, human ones. And if that's the kind of storytelling you are here for, go ahead and subscribe
so you never miss what's coming next.
Thank you for listening to the end. This is Zach from the Sage Chronicles. If you ever face betrayal, property, or marriage conflicts, please choose peace over revenge. Document everything. Talk to your family counselor or visit your state citizens mediation center for lawful resolution. Your story can still end with dignity. If this lesson helped you, please like, comment your respectful advice, and subscribe for more wisdom. See you next time.